Senator Mitt Romney had built a reputation over the years for being measured in his approach, often direct but rarely theatrical. When he turned his attention toward Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, however, it was clear he intended to make a point. In a committee room filled with reporters, staffers, and fellow lawmakers, Romney began by carefully framing his concerns about what he perceived as gaps in her record. He didn't shout, nor did he raise his voice. Instead, he leaned on the authority of his long political career to cast doubt on hers. He started by pointing out that Crockett was still relatively new to Congress and questioned whether she had truly left a meaningful mark. He listed off broad categories where he felt she should have shown more leadership, legislation, bipartisan efforts, and visible results for her district. To Romney, these were the benchmarks of a productive political career, and he made sure his words carried the weight of someone who had decades of experience at the highest levels of American politics. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Compared to the standards he believed members of Congress should uphold, Crockett was falling short. As Romney continued, his tone carried a mixture of skepticism and authority. He drew comparisons to other lawmakers, both past and present, who had quickly established themselves with landmark bills or influential committee work. Then, with a faint shake of his head, he suggested that Crockett's contributions had yet to reach that same level of significance. The phrasing was deliberate. He wasn't outright dismissing her efforts, but he was questioning their impact, planting the idea that perhaps her career was still more about appearances than substance. Those listening in the room could feel the tension beginning to build. Romney had chosen his words with precision, highlighting the importance of results over rhetoric. He mentioned that in his years of service, from his time as governor to his tenure in the Senate, he had seen many new representatives arrive in Washington with energy and ambition, only to lose focus when it came to delivering concrete achievements. By aligning Crockett with that cautionary tale, he framed her as a politician who might be heading down that same path. Romney's remarks weren't delivered in anger, but they carried a sharper edge than some expected. They reflected not only his skepticism toward her record, but also his broader concerns about the new generation of lawmakers who, in his view, often placed more value on gaining media attention than on passing substantive legislation. For Romney, this was more than just a critique of Crockett as an individual. It was a commentary on what he saw as a troubling trend in politics, and by singling her out, he ensured the spotlight fell squarely on her response. Throughout his remarks, Romney maintained the same steady composure he had shown in countless political exchanges before. He was careful to stay within the bounds of professionalism, but every sentence seemed designed to test Crockett's credibility. The longer he spoke, the clearer it became that he wasn't simply raising questions for the sake of discussion. He was challenging her directly, questioning whether her presence in Congress was backed by real, measurable accomplishments or merely by rhetoric and ambition. Observers noted how Romney shifted his gaze toward her as he made his final point. With an even tone, he reminded the committee that the American people deserved leaders who could show results, not just promises. It was the kind of statement that had the rhythm of a closing argument, a line that lingered in the air as he leaned back in his chair. The message was unmistakable. In his eyes, Jasmine Crockett still had much to prove. When Senator Mitt Romney finished outlining his concerns, the room naturally shifted toward Jasmine Crockett. Many expected her to fire back immediately, to counter his words with the same energy and force that often characterizes political debate. But she didn't rush to respond. Instead, she took a deliberate pause, adjusting the papers in front of her, as if to signal that she wasn't rattled. The contrast between Romney's sharp critique and her composed demeanor was striking. Rather than meeting his skepticism with defensiveness, Crockett leaned on a calm, measured tone. She acknowledged that Romney had raised questions about her work, but she didn't let his words dictate the direction of her reply. Instead, she chose to focus on the power of facts and evidence. Her approach wasn't to match his critique blow for blow. It was to shift the entire dynamic of the exchange by grounding it in verifiable accomplishments. The way she carried herself made a clear impression. Crockett didn't speak quickly or emotionally. She carefully selected her words, ensuring that each statement was supported by documentation she had at hand. For every suggestion Romney made about her lack of meaningful results, she countered by referring to specific examples of legislation she had co-sponsored or initiatives she had pushed forward in her district. It wasn't about grandstanding, it was about showing the work she had already done. At one point, when Romney questioned whether her presence in Congress had translated into substantive contributions, she calmly reached into her binder. With steady hands, she pulled out a report detailing the funding she had secured for local infrastructure projects. She didn't wave it dramatically, nor did she make a spectacle of handing it over. She simply laid it on the table as a matter-of-fact response. The quiet confidence in her action carried more weight than any fiery rebuttal could have. Romney, known for his ability to unsettle less experienced lawmakers, found himself listening more intently than he likely expected. Crockett wasn't sparring with him. She was methodically addressing his points with tangible proof. In politics, where so much depends on perception, her decision to remain composed shifted the focus away from personalities and onto the facts themselves. That shift worked in her favor, because once the evidence was in view, the strength of her record spoke louder than any verbal defense could. The room, which had been bracing for a heated back and forth, grew quieter as her response unfolded. Staffers and fellow committee members leaned in, realizing this was not going to be the typical clash of egos. Crockett wasn't interested in trading barbs with Romney. She was demonstrating that she had anticipated challenges like his, and had come prepared to meet them. The calm way she presented her evidence made it clear that she understood the stakes of the moment and that she wasn't going to let anyone define her career without her having a say. Her composure stood out even more when compared to Romney's calculated critique. His words had been layered with the authority of years in politics, but Crockett's choice to respond without defensiveness neutralized much of the imbalance. Rather than appearing shaken, she looked confident, almost as if she had expected this very line of questioning. That level of readiness sent a subtle but undeniable message. She was not only capable of handling scrutiny, she could thrive under it. As she continued, Crockett emphasized the importance of focusing on results rather than narratives. She noted that while she might not yet have decades of experience in Congress, her work already reflected tangible benefits for her constituents. Each point she made was tied back to evidence she had prepared in advance. This careful balance of calm delivery and factual grounding gave her response a credibility that couldn't easily be brushed aside. Romney, who had entered the exchange with an air of authority, found himself facing a colleague who wasn't willing to be boxed into the role of a newcomer still finding her footing. Crockett's.com/evidence-driven approach challenged the assumptions he had laid out. She didn't need to raise her voice or mirror his authority. She simply let her record, presented clearly and without exaggeration, reshape the conversation. When Jasmine Crockett began presenting the material she had prepared, the atmosphere in the room shifted almost instantly. Up until that point, Senator Mitt Romney's critique had framed her as someone whose career might lack measurable accomplishments. His words carried weight, and his long tenure in politics gave him credibility in questioning whether her record truly demonstrated impact. But the moment Crockett reached into her binder and began pulling out documents, the balance of the exchange started to tilt. She didn't just offer general statements about her work, she had concrete receipts. One of the first pieces she laid on the table was a summary of legislation she had co-sponsored bills focused on housing support, healthcare access, and criminal justice reform. Each entry was backed by citations, timelines, and the names of colleagues from both sides of the aisle who had worked with her. Rather than responding with vague claims about being active in Congress, she allowed the data to make her case. Romney, who had implied that her legislative work was still in its infancy, found himself confronted with a stack of evidence that said otherwise. Crockett highlighted specific bills that had not only passed committees but had also advanced to the House floor, showcasing her ability to navigate the often complicated process of building consensus. She wasn't exaggerating, nor was she leaning on lofty promises. She was laying out a record of progress that was both documented and undeniable. She then moved on to another area that Romney had alluded to, delivering results for constituents. Pulling out a separate folder, Crockett presented letters and reports detailing the funding she had helped secure for projects in her district. There were allocations for road repairs, school programs, and local health initiatives. Some of the documents included notes from city officials thanking her for her role in pushing those projects forward. She read one excerpt aloud, not with flourish, but with a steady clarity that underscored her point. Her work had made a tangible difference in the lives of people back home. Observers noted the contrast between Romney's critique and Crockett's presentation. Romney had relied on perception, on the authority of experience to question whether she was living up to her role. Crockett countered with facts so specific that they couldn't be brushed aside as political spin. She was demonstrating that her career was already producing results, and that the evidence of her work could withstand scrutiny from even the most seasoned senator in the room. The depth of her preparation also became apparent as she moved through her stack of documents. For every claim she made, she had supporting material. When Romney had suggested that she hadn't built bipartisan credibility, she produced records showing collaborations with lawmakers across the aisle, including correspondence on shared policy goals. When he implied that she was still too focused on visibility rather than substance, she countered with detailed timelines, showing how her committee work had shaped policy debates in ways that often went unnoticed by the public eye. By the time she finished laying out her evidence, the committee table was covered with papers and reports. It wasn't a performance meant to impress the cameras. It was a demonstration of thoroughness. Crockett had anticipated the skepticism and had come prepared to prove her record step by step. Each document served as a reminder that behind the headlines and speeches, there was a body of work that reflected her commitment to the responsibilities she had taken on. Romney, who had initially leaned forward in challenge, leaned back as her presentation unfolded. The evidence on display didn't erase his years of experience or diminish the weight of his words, but it did alter the dynamic of the exchange. He had begun by casting doubt on her accomplishments, but now he was faced with a clear record that contradicted the impression he had painted. It wasn't an emotional rebuttal, nor was it a verbal sparring match. It was the quiet power of receipts doing what rhetoric alone couldn't. Asterisk. Those in the room could sense that Romney hadn't expected this level of preparedness. His challenge had created an opportunity for Crockett to prove herself, and she had seized it by showing that her career was already defined by measurable contributions. The documents spoke for themselves, leaving little room for interpretation. What had begun as an attack on her credibility was now an undeniable showcase of the work she had done. Asterisk. As Jasmine Crockett wrapped up her presentation of documents and testimony, the energy inside the committee room was noticeably different. What had started with Senator Mitt Romney's sharp critique now felt far more balanced, even weighted in her favor. His earlier words about her career lacking substance had been clear, and they had carried the authority of someone who had spent decades in public life. Yet, as her evidence accumulated on the table, it became increasingly difficult to dismiss her work. The shift wasn't dramatic in tone, but it was obvious in the body language of those present. Asterisk. Staffers who had initially braced for a verbal clash now leaned in with quiet curiosity. Members of the committee, some of whom had seemed aligned with Romney's skepticism, were flipping through the documents she provided, taking in the details of the projects she had spearheaded. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, but the steady rhythm of her presentation had established credibility in a way that could not easily be undone. Asterisk. Romney himself was a key part of that shift. When he had first spoken, he projected authority, using his experience to question whether Crockett's career had real weight. He had leaned forward, his words deliberate and confident, but as her response unfolded, observers noticed a change. At moments, Romney's expression shifted from skepticism to something closer to concentration. His posture eased back slightly, a small but telling indication that her evidence had earned his attention, if not his full agreement. Asterisk. The most striking aspect of the exchange was how quickly the mood of the room adapted to Crockett's composure. Instead of being remembered as the recipient of a critique from a senior senator, she was now seen as the lawmaker who calmly and effectively stood her ground. The fact that Romney himself appeared to take note of her preparedness amplified the significance of the moment. In a setting where perception often shapes reality, her ability to surprise him with the depth of her record altered the narrative entirely. Asterisk. For those watching, the contrast between the beginning and the end of the exchange was clear. Romney had framed her as inexperienced, but by the time she finished, she looked anything but unprepared. Her careful reliance on evidence had created a turning point. The hearing was no longer about whether she had done enough to justify her role. It was about how effectively she had demonstrated her ability to meet challenges head-on. Asterisk. Even in his silence, Romney contributed to that shift. He didn't attempt to interrupt her or dismiss the evidence she laid out. His decision to remain quiet while she spoke carried weight, especially because he was known for rarely backing down from defending his critiques. The absence of rebuttal was itself a signal that her presentation had at least made an impression. For Crockett, that impression was significant. It meant that even those most skeptical of her career had to acknowledge the seriousness with which she approached her work. Asterisk. The room reflected that acknowledgement in subtle ways. Conversations that followed the hearing referenced not only Romney's challenge, but also Crockett's response. Instead of being remembered as a moment where she was questioned, it became one where she redefined the conversation. The quiet surprise that crossed Romney's face as she presented her record became a lasting image, one that added weight to her credibility. Asterisk. It wasn't about victory in a dramatic sense, but about earning respect through preparation and evidence. The shock in the room wasn't loud or disruptive. It was in the way perceptions shifted without a single raised voice. Crockett had managed to transform scrutiny into validation, and Romney's reaction played an important role in highlighting that transformation. Asterisk. The entire exchange showed how quickly the tone of a political encounter can change when one side comes ready, not just with words, but with proof. Romney had expected to press his advantage as the seasoned statesman questioning a relative newcomer. Instead, he found himself quietly absorbing the evidence that challenged his assumptions. For Crockett, that moment of surprise across his face and the way it reverberated among everyone present was as telling as any speech she could have delivered. Asterisk. What unfolded in that committee room between Senator Mitt Romney and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was more than just a political battle. It was a study in how preparation, composure, and evidence can completely change the direction of a narrative. Romney began the exchange from a position of authority, using his years of experience to raise pointed doubts about Crockett's career and her effectiveness as a lawmaker. His questions were sharp and deliberate, and at first glance it seemed he held the advantage. But what no one fully anticipated was the quiet, calculated way Crockett would respond. Asterisk. Instead of engaging in a heated debate, Crockett relied on a strategy that is often underestimated in the world of politics: The power of facts. With patience and precision, she laid out a record of her work bills co-sponsored, funding, secured, and community projects directly impacted by her efforts. Each document she presented added another layer of credibility, building a case that was impossible to ignore. She didn't just say she had done the work, she showed it in black and white. Romney, for his part, represented the voice of skepticism. His challenge gave Crockett an opportunity to prove herself. But his reaction, as she unfolded her evidence, revealed something important. He did not interrupt, nor did he attempt to dismiss what was in front of him. His quiet surprise and eventual silence underscored how effectively Crockett had met the moment. For someone who had framed her as lacking results, he now found himself confronted with proof that her record was deeper than he had assumed. The committee room witnessed more than an exchange between two lawmakers, it witnessed a turning point in perception. Crockett left that hearing not as someone who had been questioned, but as someone who had demonstrated the strength of her work under scrutiny. The documents she produced didn't just answer Romney's critique, they reframed the conversation about her career entirely. Her calm, evidence-based approach not only silenced doubts in the moment, but also set a precedent for how she would be viewed moving forward. In the world of politics, where rhetoric often overshadows reality, moments like these stand out. Romney's challenge was a test, and Crockett's response was a demonstration of resilience and readiness. She showed that she could withstand pressure from even the most seasoned voices, and that her career wasn't built on promises alone. It was backed by tangible results. As the hearing concluded, the room reflected on more than just the specifics of policy. What lingered was the image of a congresswoman who had turned criticism into an opportunity, and a senator who, despite his doubts, was forced to acknowledge the depth of her preparation. The encounter highlighted a truth often forgotten in political life. In the end, it is not just words that matter, but the evidence that